On that day, no one remembered his birthday. The millionaire was left alone in the park until a poor girl approached him with a piece of cake. What happened next changed everything. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which city you're from. The morning of his birthday arrived with a heaviness that Charles had grown used to over the years, but it pressed differently this time. He woke up before dawn, as he always did, sitting on the edge of his large bed with his back hunched, hands resting on his knees, staring into the dim glow of a single lamp across the room. The house was silent, but it was a heavy silence, layered with the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the old clock on the wall, and the soft creaks of wood that had settled with age in the structure of the house. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold air fill his lungs before exhaling through parted lips, wishing, just for a moment, that someone would call out to him from another room, reminding him that he was not alone in this wide, cold house. Charles, a man who had once commanded men in uniform with unflinching authority, who had sat at negotiation tables that decided the fate of cities and military bases, now felt the weight of time folding around him like an unkind blanket. His hair was white and cropped close to his scalp, his skin weathered with sun lines from years of deployment under harsh skies, and his left leg, replaced by a metal prosthesis after the war, reminded him with every step that he had given pieces of himself to a world that had long since moved on. The metals in the glass case near the living room window caught the first light of morning, their polished surfaces shining faintly, but they were silent and cold, unable to fill the spaces of a life once brimming with purpose. His phone lay on the nightstand, screen dark, untouched since the last message 2 days ago, when his daughter Laura had texted a brief, "Busy, call you later," that had never been followed up. His son, Michael, lost in the swirl of corporate deals and overseas meetings, rarely remembered even Christmas, let alone the birthday of a father who had once carried him on his shoulders. And there was Emily, the youngest, the one who used to dance around the living room, her laughter filling the air like chimes in the wind, now distant, living states away, with a family of her own, barely finding time to send him a photo of his grandchildren once a month. The absence of them all, not just in presence but in thought, was the heaviest burden he carried, and today it pressed down with the relentless precision. He moved slowly through the house, his steps heavy but measured, the echo of his prosthetic foot tapping lightly on the polished wood floors. The walls were adorned with photographs from different eras of his life. A younger Charles in uniform, standing tall, medals pinned to his chest, his late wife Clara beside him with her warm smile that softened even the hardest days, the children, when they were small, playing in the garden, covered in mud and laughter. The photos were a gallery of a life once vibrant, now reminders of what was no longer within reach. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, a scent he still brewed each morning even if he rarely drank more than a single cup. He prepared it with the same care he used to prepare his uniform, precise and methodical, each step a ritual to keep the day from slipping too quickly into emptiness. He poured the dark liquid into a heavy ceramic mug Clara had loved, the one with the blue flowers that had faded over years of washing, and held it between his palms, feeling its warmth seep into his bones. Sitting by the window, he watched as a light crept slowly across the garden, illuminating the flowers Clara had planted years ago, now overgrown, but still blooming in wild, stubborn defiance. The roses, once carefully pruned, reached in all directions, and the lavender bent under the weight of its own growth. But there was something comforting in the chaos they presented, a reminder that life, even untended, found its way forward. The hours moved slowly, marked only by the shifting light and the occasional chirp of a bird outside the window. Charles checked his phone periodically, each time hoping for a message, a call, a reminder that someone out there still remembered that today was the day he was born. But the screen remained dark, reflecting only his own face, the deep lines across his forehead, the tiredness in his eyes, the loneliness that had settled into his expression so thoroughly that it felt like a second skin. By afternoon, the quiet had grown unbearable. He found himself pacing the hallway, the portraits of his children and Clara watching him with frozen smiles, memories of a time when birthdays meant a table crowded with voices, the scent of cake in the air, candles flickering while everyone sang off-key, and Clara's hand finding his, under the table, squeezing gently to remind him that they were together in this life. The absence of those moments clawed at him, and the silence became a weight pressing into his chest. He decided, almost without realizing, to leave the house. He needed air, needed to feel the world around him, to see life moving even if he felt like he was standing still. He pulled on his coat, the one Clara had bought him years ago, still warm and well kept, the fabric soft from use, and adjusted the collar before stepping outside. The sky was a soft gray, clouds drifting lazily as a cool breeze brushed against his face, carrying the scents of damp earth and cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Charles walked slowly, each step deliberate, his cane in one hand, tapping lightly on the sidewalk, the prosthetic foot moving in rhythm with the steady beat of his heart. The neighborhood was quiet, a few cars passing occasionally, the drivers lost in their own worlds, not noticing the older man making his way down the street. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distant yard, a reminder of years gone by, of birthday parties where balloons floated in the air and the sound of small feet running across the grass filled the day with warmth. As he approached the park, the familiar path opened before him, lined with old trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze, leaves whispering softly in the air. The benches were empty, save for a few elderly couples sitting together, sharing quiet conversations, or a young mother watching her child on the swings, the creak of metal chains carrying across the space like a quiet melody. Charles found his way to a bench near the pond, where the water rippled with the movement of ducks gliding across its surface, the reflection of the sky broken by gentle waves. He sat down carefully, setting his cane against the side of the bench, and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment to feel the air around him, to let the sounds of the park fill the emptiness that had followed him from the house. The breeze carried the scent of water and the faint aroma of blooming flowers, and he let himself breathe deeply, grounding himself in the present, even as the past tugged at the edges of his mind. Opening his eyes, he watched as families moved through the park, children laughing, couples walking hand in hand, groups of teenagers sprawled on the grass, their voices rising in bursts of chatter and laughter. It was a world alive with movement, a world that seemed so distant from the quiet he carried within him. He felt like a spectator, sitting on the edge of life, watching it pass by while he remained rooted in place. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the park, Charles realized that the day was nearly over, that his birthday would pass like so many before it, unnoticed by the world, unmarked by celebration, slipping quietly into memory as just another day among many. The thought brought a tightness to his chest, a sharp pang of grief for the life he once had, for the love that had filled these days with meaning. He adjusted his coat around him, feeling the chill of the evening breeze, and rested his hands on his lap, looking down at them, at the lines and scars that told the story of a life lived fully, a life of service, of love, of loss. His wedding ring, still on his finger, caught the last rays of sunlight, glinting softly, a reminder of promises made and kept even after death. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up, expecting to see another family, another couple, passing by without noticing him. But instead, a small figure approached, moving carefully along the path, a young girl with dark skin and a worn backpack slung over one shoulder, her shoes scuffed and too large, her hair tied back in a simple braid that swung as she walked. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the park, taking in the people, the birds, the shifting light, as if the world was a place to be studied, understood, navigated with care. Charles watched her without moving, something about her presence pulling at him, a reminder of Emily when she was small, the way she would wander the park with curious eyes, asking questions about the trees, the birds, the clouds. The girl stopped near the pond, watching the ducks for a moment, her face unreadable, then turned and noticed him sitting on the bench. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant something passed between them, a recognition of loneliness, of quiet observation, of being on the outside looking in. She looked away first, adjusting the strap of her backpack, and began to walk again, this time moving closer to where he sat. Charles felt a stirring in his chest, a curiosity, a sense of connection he hadn't felt in so long, as if the universe had placed this small, quiet child in his path for a reason he could not yet understand. As she approached, the sun dipped lower, casting the park in hues of gold and pink, the world softening around the edges. Charles took a breath, steadying himself, sensing that something was about to change, that this quiet encounter would ripple into the stillness of his life in ways he could not yet see. The day was ending, but for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was ending with it. The girl stopped a few steps away, looking at him again, her eyes deep and calm, carrying a strength that belied her age. The park seemed to hush around them, the sounds fading into the background as they regarded each other. Two strangers on the cusp of a conversation neither of them had planned for, but both somehow needed. The breeze lifted, carrying the scent of the water and the soft rustle of leaves, and in that quiet moment, Charles felt something shift inside him, a door opening, a thread connecting him to the world once more, fragile but present, reminding him that even on a day forgotten by those he loved, there was still space for connection, still room for hope. The light continued to fade, and the street lights began to flicker on, one by one, casting small pools of light across the park. Charles remained still, waiting, as the girl adjusted her backpack once more, took a breath, and stepped closer, closing the space between them with quiet, steady steps. She stopped in front of him, her gaze unwavering, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the world around them fading into the background, the quiet of the evening settling gently over them. Charles did not know what would happen next, but for the first time in many years he felt ready to find out. The street lights continued their quiet vigil as the last of the sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind a stretch of purple dusk that wrapped the park in soft darkness. Charles remained seated, his back straightening slowly as the girl stepped closer, the steady, uncertain click of her shoes on the path the only sound between them. She was small, a fragile sort of small, but there was nothing fragile in her gaze. Her eyes were wide, deep pools reflecting the streetlight glow, alive with a brightness that the world had not yet managed to dull. She clutched the strap of her backpack with one hand, her thumb rubbing circles on the frayed fabric as if to reassure herself that she was grounded, present, and in control of whatever fear might have been twisting quietly in her stomach. She did not speak at first, and neither did Charles. Instead, he found himself leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees as he studied her. In her silence was a confidence that reminded him of men he had once commanded, young soldiers who stood at attention waiting for orders, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to know that someone saw them. It struck him then how desperately the world could starve a person of being seen, truly seen, and he wondered what this girl had already endured in her short life that she could stand before a stranger so still, so quiet, so fiercely present. A breeze swept through, rustling the leaves and lifting a strand of her hair across her cheek, which she brushed away with the back of her hand before glancing down, breaking the eye contact that had tethered them to that moment. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, looking back toward the street as if to confirm that she was still safe, still unnoticed by the wider world, before turning her gaze back to Charles. It was then that he noticed the small box she was holding in her other hand, the edges of it wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the evening moisture that hung in the air. It was a cake, he realized, or something like it, homemade or from a small shop, its shape uneven beneath the plastic, with a single candle poking through the wrap like a flag planted in uncertain ground. She held it out to him, her hand trembling just slightly, her eyes searching his face for something, a sign that he would not reject her, that he would accept this small, fragile offering. For a moment, he could not move. The gesture, so unexpected, so painfully kind that it seemed to freeze the air around him. His chest tightened, a knot forming beneath his ribs as he looked from the small cake to the girl's face, her dark skin catching the glow of the streetlight, her expression hovering between hope and fear, as if she had spent her life expecting the world to say no. Finally, with a careful breath, he reached out and took the cake from her, his hands larger, weathered, and shaking as they brushed against her small fingers. Her eyes flickered at the contact, widening for a heartbeat before she quickly pulled her hand back, clutching the strap of her backpack again, grounding herself in its familiar weight. He placed the cake gently on the bench beside him, his fingers lingering on the plastic wrap, feeling the warmth still held in the small package, the warmth of her hands, the warmth of her intention. She stood there, waiting, and it was clear she would not leave until he acknowledged her properly. Charles cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet park, and gestured for her to sit on the other end of the bench. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the street again, before slowly, carefully, lowering herself onto the edge of the bench, keeping her body turned slightly away, as if ready to run if the moment demanded it. The distance between them was respectful, but her presence filled the space. Her quiet breathing, the faint scent of something floral from her hair, the nervous tapping of her thumb against her knee. They sat like that for a long while, the silence stretching comfortably now as if the world had paused to allow them this moment. Charles glanced at the cake again, the single candle poking through, and felt a strange ache in his chest. It was a reminder of birthdays past, of candles blown out while laughter filled the room, of Clara's hands lighting matches with a gentle smile, of children shouting over each other to sing the birthday song, off-key and full of joy. This single candle, unlit in the evening air, held all of that in its small, fragile presence, a reminder of what had been and what might still be possible, even in this late chapter of his life. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small box of matches he carried out of habit more than need, and struck one carefully, shielding the flame from the breeze with his hand as he lit the candle on the cake. The small flame flickered, wavering for a moment before standing tall, a tiny beacon in the dusk that reflected in the girl's eyes as she watched it, her expression softening, her lips parting in the smallest of smiles that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. The flame seemed to draw the warmth back into the air, its light pooling around them, pushing back the darkness of the evening in a quiet, gentle way. Charles looked at the flame, then at the girl, and he realized he did not know her name. It felt wrong to share such an intimate moment without knowing that, and yet he felt that asking would break something fragile between them. Instead, he let the moment stand, allowing the warmth of the flame to fill the silence, allowing the presence of this small, brave girl to be enough for now. The girl reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook, flipping through the pages with careful fingers until she found a blank one near the back. She tore it out with a soft rip that sounded louder in the quiet park and held it out to him along with a pen. Her eyes met his, and this time he saw the insistence in them, the quiet demand that he participate, that he accept whatever this moment was meant to be. He took the paper and the pen, looking down at the blank sheet, the lines faint and uneven, the edges frayed from being carried around in a backpack that had seen many days. He hesitated, then wrote his name, slowly, the letters coming out unevenly as his hand shook slightly, the pen scratching across the paper. He handed it back to her, and she took it carefully, folding it and tucking it into a small pocket on the inside of her backpack before zipping it shut, as if it were something precious that needed to be kept safe. She looked at the cake, then back at him, and gave a small nod, the tiniest of smiles touching her lips again before vanishing. Charles understood then that she wanted him to make a wish, to blow out the candle, to complete the moment she had created for him with such quiet determination. He looked at the flame, the way it danced in the evening air, and for the first time in many years he allowed himself to want something, to wish for something, even if it was something as simple as not feeling alone for a little while longer. He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and let it out gently, the flame flickering and then going out, leaving a thin trail of smoke that curled into the air before disappearing. The darkness returned, but it was softer now, the streetlights holding it at bay, the warmth of the moment lingering around them. The girl stood up, adjusting her backpack again, and for a moment Charles thought she would leave, but instead she reached out and placed her small hand on his shoulder, a touch so light it was almost a whisper, but it was there, real and warm, grounding him in the moment. She did not say anything, and neither did he, but in that simple touch was a conversation, a promise, an acknowledgement that they had shared something important, something that did not need words to be understood. When she finally pulled her hand away, she gave him one last look, her eyes meeting his, and then she turned and walked away, her small figure moving down the path, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the street lights. Charles watched her go, the ache in his chest shifting, softening, becoming something different, something less heavy, less sharp. He looked down at the small cake, the candle still standing, the smoke from the extinguished flame drifting into the cool night air. He reached out and touched the plastic wrap, feeling the warmth still held within, the warmth of her gesture, of her courage, of her quiet kindness that had reached across the space between them and reminded him that the world could still be soft, that people could still be good, that moments like this could still happen, even when you least expected them. Charles sat there for a long time, the cake beside him, the park quiet and emptying as the night grew deeper. The breeze rustled the leaves, the water in the pond rippled gently, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, the sound carrying across the cool air. He felt the weight of the day settling into him, but it was a different weight now, a softer one, tempered by the memory of the girl's eyes, her quiet strength, her simple, powerful act of kindness. As he finally stood, adjusting his coat and picking up the cake, he felt a small, almost imperceptible smile touch his lips, the first in a long time that felt real, that felt earned. He began the slow walk back home, the street lights guiding his way, the cake held carefully in his hands, a small reminder that even in the quietest, loneliest moments, the world could still surprise you, could still reach out and touch you with kindness, could still remind you that you were alive, and that, perhaps, was enough. Charles returned home that night, the small cake carefully placed on the table near the window where the moonlight could touch it, making the plastic wrap shimmer softly. The apartment felt different as he entered, a shift so subtle he almost missed it. But it was there, in the way the shadows seemed softer, the air less heavy, the silence less oppressive. It was as if the girl's kindness had followed him home, clinging to him like the faint floral scent that had lingered in the air after she left, reminding him that the world, despite its darkness, still contained small lights. He sat in his chair, the same chair where he spent most of his evenings, staring out the window at the city lights flickering in the distance. His reflection in the glass was a pale, tired echo, the lines on his face deep, his shoulders slumped from years of carrying burdens he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Yet now there was a softness around his eyes, a quietness in the way he breathed, as if something had shifted, loosened inside him. The girl's presence at the park, her boldness, her quiet insistence on giving him the cake, had shaken something awake in him, something he had buried under layers of routine, grief, and resignation. He could still see her eyes, dark and determined, still feel the light touch of her small hand on his shoulder, a touch that had felt like forgiveness, like acceptance, like a reminder that he was not as invisible as he had come to believe. Days passed, each one blending into the next with the same quiet rhythm that had defined Charles's life since Clara's passing. He spent his mornings walking in the park, sitting on the same bench, hoping to see the girl again, though he never admitted that even to himself. Each day he watched the people pass by, parents with children, joggers, young couples, old friends walking arm in arm. But she did not appear. The cake remained on his table, untouched, the candle still upright, a silent promise waiting to be fulfilled. He found himself noticing things he had long ignored, the laughter of children echoing across the park, the warmth of the sun on his face as he sat quietly, the way the leaves shifted in the wind, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. He began to nod at people who passed by, sometimes receiving a nod in return, sometimes a smile. It was a small thing, but it was enough to remind him that he was a part of the world, even if just barely. One morning, as he was preparing to leave for his walk, he noticed the mail sticking out of the slot on his door. It was mostly the usual, a bill, a flyer, a catalog, but among them was a small envelope, plain and unmarked except for his name written in careful, uneven handwriting. His breath caught as he held it, recognizing the handwriting immediately, the memory of the girl's careful folding of the paper in the park returning to him in a rush. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, unfolding the single sheet inside. It was a simple note, written in the same careful handwriting. "Will you come to the library after school? I have something to show you." There was no name, but there didn't need to be. He knew it was from her. Charles stood there for a long moment, holding the note, feeling the paper between his fingers, the words imprinting themselves onto his mind. He looked around his small apartment, the morning light spilling across the floor, touching the cake on the table, making it glow softly. He felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet, persistent warmth that reminded him of the candle's small flame, of the way the girl's eyes had reflected the light in the park. That afternoon, he made his way to the library near the edge of the neighborhood, a small building with faded bricks and a creaking door that had long been his refuge before life had closed in around him. As he approached, he saw her sitting on the steps, her backpack beside her, her small hands clutching a worn book to her chest. She looked up as he approached, her eyes lighting up with a mixture of relief and quiet joy, and for a moment he saw the child she still was, beneath the brave exterior she wore like armor. She stood quickly, brushing off her skirt, and motioned for him to follow her inside. The library was quiet, the scent of old paper and polished wood filling the air, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet the only sound as they moved through the rows of shelves. She led him to a small table in the corner, away from the windows, where the light was softer, gentler, a small island of calm in the quiet hum of the library. She placed the book on the table, opening it to a page carefully marked with a piece of string. It was a children's book, the pages worn and well-loved, the colors faded but still bright enough to show the drawings of people, families, celebrations, and cakes with candles. She pointed to a picture of a birthday party. A family gathered around a small table, the child in the picture blowing out candles on a cake, the parents smiling, the room filled with warmth and love. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for understanding, for permission, for acknowledgement that he saw what she was showing him, what she was offering him. Charles felt a tightness in his throat as he looked at the picture, then at her. The connection between the two clear, unspoken, but powerful. She wanted him to know that birthdays mattered, that celebrating them mattered, even if there was no one else around, even if the world was heavy and hard. He nodded slowly, unable to find words, but she seemed to understand, a small, relieved smile touching her lips before disappearing again. She closed the book carefully, placing it back into her backpack, and pulled out another small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with a piece of string. She handed it to him with both hands, looking up at him with a quiet determination that left no room for refusal. Charles took the package, feeling its weight, the softness of the paper, the care with which it had been wrapped. He untied the string slowly, peeling back the paper to reveal a small, hand-knitted scarf, the yarn uneven but warm, the colors bright in a way that felt like hope. He looked at her, his eyes stinging with tears he did not try to hide, and she nodded again, as if to tell him it was okay, that it was meant for him, that he was allowed to accept it. They sat together in the library for a long time, the scarf resting in his lap, the quiet of the space wrapping around them like a blanket. She pulled out a small notebook again, writing something carefully before tearing out the page and handing it to him. This time, it was her name, written carefully, Amara. Beneath it, she had drawn a small candle, the flame bright and steady, a symbol of the moment they had shared in the park, of the promise she had made to him without words. Charles held the paper, the name and the drawing, and felt something shift inside him, something that had been stuck for a long time loosening, allowing the warmth to spread, to fill the spaces that had been empty for too long. He looked at Amara, this small, brave girl who had given him a cake, a scarf, her name, and more than that, had given him a reminder that life still held moments of light, moments worth holding on to. As the library closed and they stepped back into the evening air, Amara walked beside him, her small steps matching his slow, careful pace. They did not speak, but it was enough to walk together, to share the silence, to know that they were not alone as the streetlights flickered on, lighting their path as they made their way back through the quiet streets, the scarf warm in his hands, the paper with her name tucked carefully into his pocket, the world around them softer, gentler, filled with the quiet promise of connection and hope. The days that followed took on a different rhythm, one that Charles had not known in many years. He found himself looking forward to each morning, rising with the sun casting long golden stripes across the wooden floor of his modest apartment, warming the coolness of dawn. The scarf Amara had knitted remained near him, draped over the arm of his chair, its bright colors a reminder that someone had thought of him, that someone cared enough to create something with her own small, careful hands. Each day, Charles returned to the park, often carrying small things, with him now. A paper bag with 2 sandwiches, an apple, or a book he thought she might like, though he could not be certain what a child like Amara might enjoy reading. Sometimes he simply carried the hope that she would be there again, sitting under the tree with her knees drawn up, eyes following the movements of birds as they hopped across the grass, or that she would appear behind him, tapping him gently on the shoulder, her smile small and cautious but warm enough to ease the cold edges of his solitude. Amara's visits were not daily, but when she did appear, it was as if the world brightened around them, her presence scattering the heavy clouds that often lingered over Charles's thoughts. They would sit together, sharing the sandwiches he brought, Amara eating carefully, savoring each bite, while Charles found himself watching her, noticing how thin she was, how her eyes would sometimes drift away to a distance only she could see before returning to the present with a resilience that moved him deeply. Sometimes she would bring small treasures, a rock shaped like a heart, a feather with a streak of bright blue, a piece of string she had found that was just long enough to tie around her wrist as a bracelet. Each time she handed him one of these small gifts, she would watch him with solemn eyes until he accepted it with gentle hands, thanking her quietly, understanding that these were pieces of her world, her offering of trust. Charles began to learn small pieces of her story in the silences between their conversations. She never offered her words easily, but sometimes as they watched the ducks glide across the pond or listened to the breeze rustling through the leaves, she would say something that opened a window into her life. She spoke of shelters that felt cold, of nights spent listening to footsteps in the dark, of a mother who was often tired and sad, whose smile was something Amara clung to when it appeared, rare and fleeting like a firefly's glow. She told him about the small room they sometimes stayed in, with a bed that creaked and a window that let in too much cold air at night, and how she liked to watch the stars through that window, imagining they were candles in the sky, each one a wish she could make when she felt brave enough to believe in wishes. Charles listened without interrupting, the quiet words folding into his heart, each one a reminder of how much this small girl carried on her thin shoulders, how much strength lived in her despite the weight of her world. One afternoon, Amara appeared with a plastic bag in her hand, holding it close to her chest as she approached the bench where Charles waited. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of pride and hesitation as she held out the bag to him, insisting he take it before she would sit down. Inside was a small cupcake, its frosting slightly smudged with a single bright candle stuck in the center, the wax a cheerful yellow that stood out against the chocolate swirl of the frosting. "It's for tomorrow," she said quietly, looking down at her shoes as she spoke, her voice so soft Charles had to lean forward to hear. "Your real birthday." Charles felt the air catch in his chest as he looked at the cupcake, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the bag. The last time someone had remembered his birthday had been years ago, when Clara was still alive, her laughter filling the apartment as she tried to bake him a cake that would always sink in the middle, a tradition they had come to love. Since her passing, birthdays had become days of silence, marked only by the quiet acknowledgement of another year survived, another year endured. But now, here was Amara, this small, determined child who had remembered, who had brought him a cupcake, who had found a way to light a candle in the darkness that had become so familiar to him. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, his eyes stinging as he looked at her, wanting her to understand how much this meant to him, how deeply her kindness had touched him. That night, Charles placed the cupcake on his kitchen table, carefully positioning it in the center of a small plate, the candle still upright, waiting. He sat across from it, the room lit only by the soft glow of the lamp in the corner, and allowed himself to feel the weight of the years that had passed, the birthdays that had come and gone without notice, the silence that had settled around him like a second skin. And yet, in the quiet of that moment, he felt something different, something lighter, as if the promise of the candle was enough to keep the darkness at bay for a while longer. The following morning, Charles woke before dawn, the anticipation of the day pulling him from his dreams. He dressed carefully, choosing a clean shirt, smoothing his hair, and straightening his shoulders as he looked at his reflection in the mirror, seeing not just the lines of age, but the softness that had returned to his eyes. The scarf Amara had knitted was draped around his neck, the bright colors against the pale blue of his shirt a symbol of the quiet hope that had taken root within him. He arrived at the park before the sun had fully risen, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the air cool and crisp. The bench was empty, the grass wet with dew, and Charles sat with the cupcake on his lap, waiting, the candles still unlit, the promise of celebration lingering in the quiet morning air. He watched the park slowly come to life, joggers passing by, dogs tugging at their leashes, the world waking up around him, and he felt himself breathing in the moment, allowing himself to feel present, alive, and waiting. When Amara appeared, she was running, her backpack bouncing against her small frame, her hair catching the light as she hurried toward him, her face flushed with excitement. She stopped in front of him, catching her breath, and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, worn lighter, its paint chipped, its metal scratched. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, and nodded, a silent question that needed no words. Charles placed the cupcake on the bench between them, and Amara carefully flicked the lighter, the small flame flickering before catching, its light bright against the morning air. She leaned forward, shielding the flame from the breeze with her small hands, and lit the candle, the yellow wax glowing as the flame steadied, dancing gently in the soft wind. They both watched the candle for a moment, the flame a small, powerful reminder of warmth and light, of hope and connection, of the simple, quiet moments that could change the shape of a day, of a life. Amara looked up at him, her smile small but bright, and nodded again, a gesture that told him it was time. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then leaned forward, blowing out the candle in a single breath, the smoke curling into the air before disappearing. He opened his eyes to find Amara clapping quietly, her eyes bright, her smile wide, and for the first time in many years, Charles felt the warmth of a birthday wish made and shared, the weight of loneliness lifting as he sat beside the small, brave girl who had given him this gift. As they shared the cupcake, breaking it in half and eating it in the soft morning light, Charles felt a sense of peace settle over him. A quiet, persistent peace that told him he was no longer alone, that his days of silent birthdays and empty apartments were no longer his only reality. He looked at Amara, crumbs on her fingers, chocolate smudged on her lips, and he smiled, knowing that she had given him something far greater than a cupcake with a candle. She had given him a reason to hope again. The morning after the shared cupcake in the park, the air felt different for Charles, as if the heavy, stale stillness of his apartment had finally cracked to let in the scent of hope. The scarf Amara had knitted was now a part of his routine, wrapped carefully around his neck even on days when the sun warmed the air enough to go without. It wasn't about warmth anymore. It was about carrying the quiet reminder that someone cared enough to make something for him with her small, diligent hands. He returned to the park each day with a growing sense of expectation, a quiet hope that Amara would be there, ready to share the small moments of the day. Some days she was, bounding toward him with her wide, shy smile, and other days she was not, leaving Charles to sit quietly on the bench, the world moving around him as he read the book he had begun to carry, his eyes flicking up every few paragraphs to search for the small figure in the distance. Each time she appeared, it felt like the sun had chosen to shine only for them, a private warmth in a world that was often too cold. As the days stretched into weeks, Charles began to notice how thin she was, how the sleeves of her jacket were frayed and too short, how she pulled them over her cold hands when she thought he wasn't looking. The mother she spoke of sometimes, in fragments and half-sentences, seemed like a shadow, someone who moved in and out of her days without leaving much warmth behind. Amara never complained, never asked for anything, but her silence held stories Charles could not ignore. On a gray afternoon, when the clouds hung low and the wind tugged at the last of the autumn leaves, Charles found Amara waiting for him on the bench, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. She looked smaller than usual, her hair uncombed, her eyes shadowed with something deeper than fatigue. She didn't run up to greet him, didn't smile, just looked up when he approached, her eyes meeting his with a silent plea. Charles sat down beside her without a word, placing the paper bag with the sandwiches between them. They sat in silence for a long time, the world around them moving on as if it had no time for two people sharing the quiet. Finally, Amara spoke, her voice thin, as if she had used up all her strength just to say the words. "She lost her job again," she whispered, not looking at him, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her feet. "We had to leave the place we were staying. She said we can't go back." Charles felt something in his chest tighten, a coldness that was not from the wind seeping into his bones. He had seen the way life could strip away dignity, how quickly someone could fall from stability into the chasm of desperation. He looked at Amara, at the way her small hands were clenched around the frayed edge of her sleeve, and he knew that whatever pride he had held on to about not interfering, about letting her keep her independence, would have to be set aside. "Where are you staying now?" he asked softly. Amara shrugged, her shoulders lifting and falling as if the question was too heavy to hold. "Different places. Sometimes in the shelter, sometimes outside." The words settled between them like a weight, and for a moment Charles was back in his own memories of hard days, of watching Clara worry about bills and food, of the silent fears they shared in the quiet of the night. Fears they never spoke of because speaking them made them too real. But this was not his burden to carry alone anymore. This was Amara, this small, resilient child who had brought light into his life, and now it was his turn to offer something in return. He reached into the paper bag, pulling out the sandwiches, offering one to her with a gentle nod. She took it, holding it carefully as if it were something precious, and began to eat in small, slow bites, her eyes glancing at him with gratitude she didn't have the words to express. They ate in silence, the cold wind brushing against them, but for the first time it felt less harsh, less capable of pushing them apart. After they finished, Charles spoke carefully, choosing each word with the care of someone who knew how fragile dignity could be. "I want you to know," he began, "that if you ever need a place to warm up or a meal, you can come to my place. It's not much, but it's warm, and you'd be safe." Amara didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on the crumbs in her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench. When she finally looked up, there was something in her eyes that Charles recognized, a mix of fear and longing, the fear of hoping for something that might not last. "Thank you," she whispered. They parted that day with a promise unspoken, a promise that she would have somewhere to go if the night became too cold, if the world became too heavy for her small shoulders. Charles returned home with a new determination, moving through his apartment with a sense of purpose, cleaning the small living room, folding away the blankets, placing an extra pillow on the couch. It was not much, but it was ready, waiting, a space prepared for the child who had become the center of his days. That evening, Charles sat in his chair by the window, the scarf Amara had made draped around his shoulders, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about the small hands that had knitted the bright colors, the quiet voice that had wished him a happy birthday, the fearless way she had chosen to bring him a cupcake when no one else remembered. He realized that he could no longer stand by while she faced the cold alone. Days later, Amara appeared at his door, her small backpack slung over her shoulders, her eyes tired but resolute. She stood there, looking up at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Charles stepped aside, holding the door open, and she stepped inside, her small figure moving past him, bringing with her a warmth that filled the quiet space of his apartment. She settled into the couch, pulling the blanket over her legs, her eyes scanning the room with cautious curiosity. Charles moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of soup and bread, the steam filling the air with warmth. They ate together, the silence between them comfortable, a shared understanding that words were not always necessary to express what mattered most. That night, as Amara slept on the couch, her breathing steady and calm, Charles sat in his chair, watching over her, the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle light across the room. He felt a sense of peace he had not known in years, a quiet joy in the simple act of making sure she was safe, warm, and fed. In that small apartment, in the quiet of the night, Charles realized that his life had changed, that the loneliness he had accepted as unchangeable was no longer the truth of his days. Amara had brought with her a light that refused to be extinguished, a reminder that kindness could ripple through the hardest moments, transforming them into something bearable, even beautiful. As he closed his eyes that night, the city outside continuing its restless hum, Charles knew that this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, struggles that would test them both, but for now they had found each other, two souls crossing paths at the right moment, carrying each other toward a new tomorrow. Charles woke up to the quiet hum of the heater working against the morning chill, the soft light of dawn creeping through the edges of the heavy curtains in his small living room. He sat up, glancing toward the couch where Amara was still asleep, curled under the blanket with only the top of her braids visible. Her steady breathing filled the room with a gentle rhythm that reminded Charles how much had changed in such a short time. A few weeks ago, the apartment had felt like a cavern of old memories echoing with silence and loss. Now it felt like a place where life had returned, one small brave breath at a time. He moved quietly into the kitchen, careful not to wake her, putting on the kettle for tea and preparing oatmeal with cinnamon, the warm scent filling the space. The clink of the spoon against the bowl eventually stirred Amara, her eyes blinking open slowly as she pushed herself up, looking around with a brief moment of disorientation before remembering where she was. Her gaze settled on Charles, who gave her a small nod and a gentle smile, placing the bowl on the small table beside the couch. They ate in quiet, comfortable silence, Amara's small spoon tapping gently against the bowl as she blew on each bite to cool it down. She wore the same clothes as the day before, her shoes placed neatly by the door, and Charles made a mental note to see about getting her something warmer before winter deepened its grip on the city. As the days passed, a new routine formed between them. In the mornings, Charles would prepare breakfast before Amara left to check in with the shelter where her mother sometimes stayed, hoping each day to find news that things had improved. She returned most evenings, sometimes with a small plastic bag of clothes she had collected from donation bins, sometimes with stories of the day, people she had seen, things she had learned while sitting on the steps of the library, moments of kindness from strangers that made her eyes light up with gratitude. Charles watched her carefully, learning to read the shifts in her expression, the way her shoulders slumped when she returned without finding her mother, the way her voice lifted when she spoke about a kind woman who offered her a sandwich or a bus driver who didn't charge her for the ride. Each story, each moment she shared became a thread, stitching itself into the fabric of their days, weaving a quiet bond that neither of them needed to speak aloud to understand. One afternoon, as the sun began to slip behind the tall buildings, Amara returned earlier than usual, her steps quick, her breath visible in the cold air. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand, gripping it tightly as she stepped into the warmth of the apartment. Charles saw the tension in her small frame and stood quietly, waiting as she held out the paper to him, her eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "It's a letter," she said, her voice trembling. "From my mom." Charles took the paper, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, the words simple but heavy with desperation and exhaustion. Her mother wrote that she was leaving the city, that she couldn't take care of Amara anymore, that she hoped someone would look after her. The letter ended with a shaky apology, a promise that she would try to send something when she could, and a final, desperate sentence. "Be good, Amara. Be strong." Charles felt a heaviness in his chest as he finished reading, looking up to find Amara's eyes fixed on his, searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps permission to feel the hurt that was clear in every line of the letter. He opened his arms, and for a moment, she hesitated before stepping forward, allowing herself to lean into the embrace, her small body shaking with silent tears. That evening, the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds a heaviness too deep for words. Charles made dinner, a simple soup with vegetables and rice, and they ate slowly, Amara's spoon moving in slow circles in the bowl as she stared into the steam. Afterward, they sat together on the couch, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence, the light from the lamp casting a warm glow that made the shadows on the walls look softer. In the days that followed, Amara's spirit seemed to flicker, her usual energy dimmed by the weight of abandonment. Charles found her staring out the window for long stretches, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass, her mind far away in places he could not reach. He let her have the silence, understanding that some wounds needed time before they could be spoken of. But even in the quiet, small moments of hope returned. One morning, Charles found Amara sitting at the kitchen table, carefully sketching on scraps of paper with a pencil she had sharpened down to a stub. She looked up at him with a shy, tentative smile and showed him the drawings, simple pictures of flowers, of the park bench where they had first met, of the cupcake with the candle that had changed everything. They were simple, but they were beautiful, filled with the quiet hope that still lived in her despite everything. Charles began to see that taking care of Amara was not just about providing food and shelter, but about giving her space to be a child again, to find joy in the small things, to let her laughter return without fear. He encouraged her drawings, finding her a small sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, watching as her eyes lit up with gratitude when he placed them on the table in front of her. Slowly, the warmth returned to her eyes. The small smiles came back, and the apartment once again felt alive with the soft sound of her humming as she colored, the quiet questions she asked about the books on his shelves, the stories she shared about the things she noticed when they walked together to the corner store or when they stopped by the park, even on the coldest days. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Amara looked up at Charles with a seriousness that caught him off guard. She placed the dish she was drying on the counter and stood there, her small hands gripping the edge, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she said simply. Charles felt a lump in his throat, unable to find words that would match the gravity of her quiet gratitude. He nodded, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, understanding that this was more than thanks for a meal or a warm place to sleep. This was thanks for not leaving, for staying when others had not, for seeing her when the world had looked away. That night, as Amara slept peacefully in the next room, her small form wrapped in the warm blankets, Charles sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. He realized how much he had come to need her presence, how much she had become the reason he woke up each morning with purpose, how the laughter and life she brought into his days had filled the hollow spaces of his quiet existence. And as the wind rustled the curtains and the city moved on in the darkness, Charles made a silent promise to himself and to the small child who had become his family, that no matter what challenges came, no matter what judgments the world might cast upon them, he would protect her, care for her, and ensure that she would never again feel alone in the way that he had on so many birthdays before she appeared. This chapter of their lives, written in the quiet moments of shared meals, in the gentle care of bandaging scraped knees, in the laughter that returned to their evenings, was one that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. It was a chapter of quiet healing, of learning to trust, of building a family not through blood, but through kindness, presence, and the unwavering promise that they would face whatever came next together. The first snow of the season arrived on a quiet morning, dusting the city in a soft blanket of white that turned the gray sidewalks into something almost beautiful. Charles stood by the window, watching the flakes dance in the cold air, the street below nearly empty except for the occasional passing car, leaving dark tracks on the whitened road. He glanced back at the small dining table, where Amara was carefully peeling an orange, her fingers working with practiced precision as she separated each piece, arranging them into a small, neat circle on a plate. It had been months since she had first stepped into his life, months that had changed the rhythm of his days, filling the silences with quiet laughter, hesitant questions, and the comforting sound of her humming as she worked on her drawings in the evenings. The small apartment, once filled with nothing but the weight of the past, now held the gentle presence of a child who had learned to find safety within its walls. They had settled into a routine that was simple yet meaningful. Charles would wake early, preparing breakfast before Amara emerged from her room, rubbing sleep from her eyes and blinking against the light. They would eat together, the radio playing softly in the background, before heading out for a walk if the weather allowed, Amara's small boots crunching through the frost-covered grass as she studied the world around her with wide, curious eyes. On weekends, they would visit the library, where Amara would sit on the floor in the children's section, flipping through picture books, her lips moving silently as she read the words, her finger tracing the illustrations. Charles would watch from a nearby chair, a quiet warmth spreading through him as he saw how deeply she immersed herself in the stories, how her eyes would light up when she found a book that captured her imagination. At home, she filled her sketchbook with drawings of the world she saw and the stories she read, pages alive, with color and the careful lines of her small hands. Charles pinned her drawings on the walls next to the framed photographs of his past, creating a collage that blended memory and the present, reminding him each day that the world could hold both the pain of what was lost and the hope of what was still to come. One afternoon, as the snow continued to fall, Charles returned from the kitchen with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, placing one in front of Amara, who was working on a drawing at the table. She looked up, her eyes bright, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the apartment, and smiled, a small dimple in her cheek appearing for just a moment before she returned to her work. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the occasional crack of the heater adjusting to the cold. Amara's pencil moved across the page, her focus intense, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. When she finished, she turned the sketchbook around, showing Charles her latest drawing, a picture of the 2 of them sitting on the park bench, the trees around them heavy with snow, the small cupcake with a single candle between them. Charles felt his throat tighten as he looked at the drawing, the simplicity of it capturing something deeper than words could say. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her head, ruffling her braids lightly as she giggled, the sound ringing through the small room like a bell. As the days passed and the snow deepened, Amara began to speak more about the future, asking questions about school, about what it meant to stay in one place, about the possibility of having her own room painted in colors she liked. Charles listened to her questions, answering them with the honesty she had come to expect, telling her about the steps they would need to take, about the meetings with the lawyer, about the forms they would fill out together. It was a slow process, filled with paperwork and quiet conversations in waiting rooms, but each step felt like a promise kept. Charles watched as Amara sat quietly during the meetings, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting around the room as adults spoke around her. She would glance at him and he would give her a small nod, reminding her that she was not alone, that this time someone would stay. One evening, as the snowstorm raged outside, they sat together by the window, watching the world disappear under the thick, swirling white. Charles held a photo album on his lap, pages filled with the faces of his family, his old life, the moments that had shaped him. Amara leaned against him, her head resting on his arm as he turned the pages, explaining who each person was, telling her stories of his childhood, of the family gatherings, of the birthdays that once filled the house with laughter. When they reached the last page, Amara looked up at him, her eyes soft, her voice quiet as she asked, "Can we take a picture together? To put in here?" Charles nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat, and stood to retrieve his camera from the shelf. They stood in front of the window, the snow outside creating a soft, glowing backdrop, and Amara leaned into him, her small hand holding onto his. He set the timer, the camera flashing as it captured the moment, freezing it in a frame that would find its place among the memories, a testament to the new chapter they were building together. The next morning, the city awoke under a thick layer of snow, and Charles and Amara ventured outside, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath visible in the crisp air. They walked to the park, the trees heavy with snow, the benches nearly buried, the world hushed under the weight of winter. Amara ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the empty park as she scooped up snow in her mittens, throwing it into the air and watching it fall around her like glittering confetti. Charles watched her, his heart full, remembering the first day he had seen her in this very park. A small child with wide eyes and a brave spirit, offering him a piece of cake on his birthday, bringing warmth into a day that had once felt so cold. He joined her, their laughter mingling in the cold air, their footprints marking a path through the snow as they played, the world around them momentarily forgetting its harshness. When they returned home, cold and tired, Charles made them warm soup, and they sat together at the table, the window fogging up from the warmth inside. Amara's eyes sparkled as she talked about the snow, about the shapes she saw in the falling flakes, about the small birds that hopped from branch to branch, shaking the snow free as they moved. That night, as Amara fell asleep in her room, her sketchbook beside her pillow, Charles stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, the streetlights casting a soft glow on the snow-covered ground. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the challenges they had faced, about the promise he had made to her and to himself. The paperwork for guardianship was nearly complete, the final signatures waiting to be added, the last steps to be taken to ensure that Amara would stay with him, that she would have a home, a family, a future that was hers to build. It had not been an easy journey, but it was one worth every moment, every struggle, every quiet promise made in the darkness of the night. Charles felt a sense of peace as he turned away from the window, checking once more on Amara before heading to his own bed. She was asleep, her face peaceful, her breathing steady, the sketchbook open to the page with the drawing of them on the park bench, the small candle on the cupcake between them. As he turned off the light and lay down, the silence of the apartment was no longer heavy with loneliness, but filled with the quiet, comforting presence of family, of hope, of a future that they would face together. And as the snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in white, Charles closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would come, bringing with it the challenges and joys of a new day, and that whatever it brought, they would meet it together, no longer alone. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the other videos on this channel and share this video with someone who needs it today.